Good to go.
Lance, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I would like to call to order the Board of Education special meeting for Tuesday, July 28th, 2020. The Board of Education meeting will be conducted completely online. Executive Order N2920 supersedes prior instructions and prohibits a gathering space, even if social distancing guidelines are followed. To participate in this online meeting, please see the link on our website. Live streaming on YouTube will begin approximately at 6 p.m. when we reconvene to open session. The URL for the YouTube live streaming may be found on the NHUSD webpage just before the meeting reconvenes to open session. Are there any speakers for closed session items?
There are not.
There are no attendees. Okay. There be no speakers for closed session. The board will now leave open session and go to closed session. All right. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. Let me get this going. Okay, the board will now convene to open session and report out from closed session. Relative to item 3.1, there was no action taken on the board. The board took action in closed session to the parents' appeal to have a kindergarten student retained in kindergarten for the 2021 school year by a vote of 5-0. Okay, the Board of Education meeting for Tuesday, July 28th will be conducted completely online. Executive Order N-29-20 supersedes prior instructions and prohibits a gathering space, even if social distancing guidelines are followed. Live streaming on YouTube will begin now for the open session of the Board of Education meeting. The URL for YouTube live streaming may be found on the NHUSD Board of Education webpage just before the meeting begins at 6 p.m. There were no public comments provided to our email address for this meeting. The comment has, additionally, we do want to remind the public that we will not be responding to questions posed to those making public comment this evening. Okay. Can I get a roll call, please?
Kaur,
Here.
Canlis,
Here.
Chima.
It looks like member Chima is not yet in. Okay, so
Wong,
Here.
Nishihira.
here. Okay, moving on to 5.2. May I have a motion and a second to approve tonight's agenda meeting?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, so that was member Canlis, member Wong. Roll call.
Kaur,
Aye.
Canlis,
Aye.
Chima, Wong,
Aye.
Nishihira.
Aye. Okay, so let's just take a momentary pause and see if we can figure out how to get member Chima into the meeting.
President Nishihara, I texted Ms. Valdez, who's hopefully working with her. Up she is. So hopefully she'll be here soon.
All right. With that, then I think that we can continue on to item 6.1, the 45-day budget update from Ms. Hellman.
Yes, good evening. Thank you, President Nishihara. Good evening to the rest of the board members and of course our audience virtually. I will share my screen as I prepare the presentation. Can you all see the presentation?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, so it feels like deja vu all over again. Unofficially, we've had 4 versions of the state budgets. What you're about to see is the 45-day revision statute that allows or calls for that. And therefore, we are meeting the statutory deadline in terms of this update, given a date in terms of when Governor Newsom signed the final state budget. So the impact are on our operating budget, which is of course the general fund, and therefore I will go over these highlights. We're going to see where we are in that budget cycle. As you know, I've been including that in all of my presentation. This is the time of year, actually in the fiscal year, that we're kind of working in 2 years. And as I mentioned, the impact are, of course, in our general fund, and I will go over those major changes. And, the fiscal pressures that we are faced, just like most districts up and down the state, have not changed. And there are more of them, especially with the advent of, COVID-19 and the different way of teaching and learning. And we're going to talk about what are we going to do next steps in terms of the update and the new information that we are presenting tonight. So this is the presentation that I've been using. Like I said, this is the time of year that we usually are kind of dabbling into the 2 fiscal years. As you can see for 2021, on the 23rd of June, we adopted our proposed budget. We are now reviewing and presenting to you for adoption the 45-day revision. At the same time, staff in fiscal are actually preparing to close the books. And these are the 2 things, the 2 worlds that we deal with around this time of the year. Now, what are those changes? These are the major changes in our general fund. The budget of record is really the proposed budget, and that was based on the May revise. But for purpose of illustration, we want to show you what it was like, from the first time that we actually started the process of developing the budget, which usually starts when we hear or when the governor unveils the January proposals. And therefore, we're trying to just to pose these 2 in terms of the discussion is this better for us or is it worse for us? Well, when you look at it, what the changes are that the governor is trying to backfill what we lost, or what we lost in ongoing revenues, and trying to infuse one-time federal dollars, which they help us in the short term, but they don't help our bottom line moving forward, and there are real expenses. So when we're looking at this, in terms of the the local control funding formula, which is the vehicle by which we are funded. If we look at the May revise, when this is not the first year that something like this happens, our expectations are lowered, and then we get the final budget, we feel like a big winner. But in reality, when you look at what was presented in January, that's really not the story that we need to tell, right? The flip side to that, so we lost on one end. I mentioned about the infusion of one-time federal dollars, and therefore those are shown on the bottom section. The estimate right now for us, combining those different buckets of one-time federal dollars, and the next page will actually provide more detail on that. It's estimated to be 6.8 million. Now remember, like I said, there's a big difference between backfilling something that would have been ongoing, that would have helped our base, versus something that's short-term and temporary. So is it worse or better for us? It's both. It's better because we're getting money to address the cost that we are facing right now, especially with a different way of having to deliver services to our families and our students. It's worse because we lost more. When we factor in the initial budget presentation, or the initial budget that was unveiled by the governor, and what we adopted versus now, we lost, because that really is in terms of what would have helped our base in the long run. So I wanted to show you those side-by-side comparisons. The last note I want to add to this is there's a difference between unrestricted and restricted, of course. So not only that it's temporary, it's one time, it's also restricted. It's not like we could spend it on general purpose dollars. So this page provides additional information on what those different buckets are in terms of the federal one-time dollars that we received. Like I said, they're estimated to be 6.8 million. I provided the funding sources. We're hearing about all of these different legislation that is allowing the infusion of these dollars. I provided in terms of the different allocation method that the state is doing this, or is doling out the money to different local agencies like us. And I'm also providing the spending timelines on these things. As you can see, most of these are needing to be spent by December of this year. So it really is intended, as I'm highlighting on this one, it really is to provide back all the learning loss that our students and our families as an impact of COVID-19 and shelter in place. The one thing to remember, and I know that our staff in teaching and learning are very busy on top of everything else, is that these funding buckets are actually contingent on completion or adoption of the learning continuity and attendance plan by September 30. So that's one important thing to remember. I provided the different alphabet soup in terms of the funding sources there, because there are new ones. Next, this is not a new slide. I usually provide this just to show you the different assumptions that we use in calculating our revenues. The takeaway here is, there is a COLA, which is an index for the state. That COLA only means something to us when it's funded. So for 2021, there in fact is a 2.31% COLA for the state. However, that COLA is not funded, so it doesn't give us anything. And therefore, what I'm showing here is the 1920 funding by the different grade spans. As you can see, K3, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9, 12. Prior to COLA was 7702, for example, for K3. Because of the zero COLA, we're getting the same rate. So this is just an illustration of that. COLA only helps us when it's funded. That's the takeaway from this page. So when we have all those different assumptions, again, I use this slide in all of my presentation just to show you when we put all of those things and all the different components, our ADA, our unduplicated pupil count, our enrollment in this massive calculator, we get a number. And it tells us what our anticipated revenue from LCFF is for that year. So as you can see here, the arrow is actually pointing to the loss from the prior year, but the revenue from LCFF is the 100.9 million. I wanted to show you, this is kind of, what a ride it has been. From January, that revenue was estimated to be 103.5 million. May revise dropped by 11 million. And now we're feeling pretty good if we compare the May revise, right? Because we went up, but in reality, we really didn't gain anything. And therefore, I just wanted to show you that how it evolved from January initial proposal by the governor. We usually provide, based on the out year projections, what it might look like. This is still kind of up in the air. It's not uncommon for cleanup language on the Budget Act to emerge later on, but for now, these are the revenue projections that we are presenting based on the current information that we have, and we expect this to change. 22-23, I call that the cliff effect from when hold harmless ends. And therefore, as you can see, we're kind of actually, we're trying to dig for more information in terms of 21-22, because as far as we know, hold harmless is for 2021. And yet I'm not seeing that in 21-22. However, should this be the case, and these are the real numbers, and like I said, we're expecting additional guidance and additional cleanup language, we will see that cliff in 22-23. But like I said, I expect new information on this. This is how, it's a very highly summarized version of our multi-year. It's to demonstrate to you what it would look like if we do nothing at all. If we don't augment our expenses, if we don't try to raise additional revenues, if we just simply say, this is what the state is telling us to use in terms of our revenue projections. This is what we think our enrollment is. And it's, that's not just a guess. We did, in fact, engage to have our enrollment study done, as you know, and we presented that. And we're pretty much on target in terms of that 10-year projection. So once we put all of that and we look at our 3-year outlook, this is what it looks like. Our problem is on the third out year, which is a good thing, right? Because we can, as we've done before, we don't wait until the problem year to solve that problem. We try to phase it in terms of how we can curtail our spending between now and then, and how we can augment our income between now and then. And we've done a lot of that, especially in the last year. So this is if we don't do anything. If we just say this is the projection, this is our enrollment, and this is what it's going to look like. Now, we're not going to let that happen. Similar to how we made reductions in the last 2 years. Without those reductions, this picture would be much, much different than what you're seeing now. I want to point out this 18.4 million is at this point in time what we are estimating to end with. We will close the books. We're in the process of doing that now, but we would finalize that sometime the end of August. And at this point in time, this is the estimated actuals, meaning this is what we would end with in the unrestricted general fund. We, of course, would want that to be a higher number because that, as you can see how it feeds into the out years, it's helping us a lot. We expect it to be higher. As an example, we're getting some refunds on some services that were not provided. We're also seeing some expenses, of course, in different areas. But like, again, our hope is that this 18.4 million would be higher than what we are seeing now. And we will have the final number presented to you in September. So as you can see, we are embedding some placeholder reduction there. And it doesn't only have to be reduction. As you know, in the executive summary that I included in the board packet, this revision not only includes the components of what the governor signed for the state as the state budget. We also now have included, because now that we have the agreement and the board had approved it at the last meeting, the revenue projection from ALIF that was approved last time. So we tried to incorporate all of the changes that we know or that transpired since June 23rd when you adopted that budget. So like I said, there are two sides to that equation, like I always say. Augment or enhance our revenues and curtail our spending. And those are the numbers that we need to be focused on. A lot of updates, small and big updates will now happen leading to the first interim report, which wraps up at the end of October. So these are our fiscal realities. Not all of these are new to us. We've been, enrollment has been declining for us in the last decade. And according to the last study, we're going to see a decline by another 1,000 students in the last couple of years. And, that's not just New Haven, that's not just Alameda County, except for a few districts, but that's the state overall. And of course, rising pension cost. This 45-day budget, the May revised and the 45-day or the final state budget actually has the same pension cost increases for us, and therefore there's no update to that. However, the 2 out years is going up again, and therefore that's not going anywhere. It's still adding to our cost from year to year. And of course, no one had seen, or we don't know yet, the far-reaching impact of this pandemic. It's not over yet, and therefore that obviously has a direct impact to the economy, which has a direct impact to our revenues, given Proposition 98. So this is the next steps. This is the path of what we would be doing in the next several weeks. Tonight, you're seeing the updated budget from what you adopted in June, on June 23rd. There is a talk of an August revise. What we're hearing is, one of two could be the catalyst for that, would be, of course, the extended tax filing deadline. If more revenues are received than projected, that could generate another revised budget. Or if HEROES is actually passed, that could also be another catalyst for another updated state budget. I mentioned earlier that we are in the process of closing those books. We want a higher ending balance because The higher that number is, the more we can buy time in terms of planning for the out years. And the next budget update that I will be presenting to you would be in December, which is the first interim report. My last final word on this, like I said, it's not just on the expenditure side. We've done a lot in terms of new programs to attract families and students into our district. We're looking at all our assets, meaning our facilities, in terms of generating revenues. And as much as we can relieve the general fund, we have those discussions. We have protocols for any new request that's not budgeted for. That's the kind of discussion and the triaging that we do in the executive cabinet. So we're looking at everything to make sure that we can relieve the general fund as much as we can. Like I said, there's always two sides to that equation. And I believe that is the update that I have for you tonight with regards to the final budget that Governor Newsom signed. And I will be able to answer questions, if any, or should I'm not going to stop share just yet. Oh, I did already, but.
All right, I'll open it up to the board. Does the board have any questions regarding the 45-day budget update? Go ahead, Member Core.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions actually. First of all, I almost did not fall off my seat as I did back in during our last board meeting, because seeing the 13 million cut in our coming years just was not something possible. So I'm glad you said it's going to be out the door anyway. So even though the numbers are looking better, I think we're still having to make some decisions to make cuts, right? That's what I'm kind of gathering as from the 45-day revise. I know you didn't mention this, but I did see in your the lengthier version you sent us of the summary, you had talked about borrowing short-term interfund borrowing happening from the sale of Cabello property. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? Because I know we talked so much about it in the past, and we always said when it can be touched and when it cannot be touched. So if you can just shed some light on what that short-term interfund borrowing looks like and when might it be implemented?
Sure. So part of the big change between the May revise and the final state budget is twice as much in terms of cash deferrals. So our apportionment, or the money that we receive from the state that has a schedule, about 18 million of that collectively will not be received in the year that we earned it. And that's why we will be short of cash. Now, we are allowed, local agencies are allowed to borrow from other district funds that we operate, that of course that happens to have money. The only exception that I'm aware of on that one is actually the bond fund. That's not allowed. There are different rules for that. But for us, in terms of borrowing, we will be resorting to first internal borrowing or interfund borrowing, and we have that Cabello proceeds in Fund 17 that we can borrow. Now, the important thing to remember here is it's a loan. We have to give it back within a 120-day period, and that is the law that we need to do. And it really is just to float us in terms of cash needs, and therefore we can do it more than once in a year as long as we're repaying it within the number of days that we have to repay it according to the law. So that's what that is. If that is not enough, given if there's more deferrals that we would hear from, or if it actually would put us in danger, because we actually should never close the year, or actually we do a cash balancing every year. All our funds should end with a positive cash. So remember, cash is different than budget, but all our funds should end with a positive cash. As in the case of, I'll pick a very great example because this happens every year. We don't get our cash in Child Nutrition Fund until October. And therefore, we have to start paying employees and buying our inventory sooner than October, and yet we don't have cash. We actually need to loan that program some cash, but we then pay it back to wherever we borrowed it from. So that's just the intent of that. And if we need anything beyond that, I mentioned in my report that we may have to resort to some pooled TRAN, and there are some programs out there in which we can do that just to have economies of scale. The cost of borrowing would be lower if we join other agencies in the pool TRAN. So that's, I hope I answered that question.
Yeah, you did. And you know what? I think this is actually a perfect segue into this. And I read an article recently, and it talked about how districts who had healthier reserves were able to weather this pandemic a little bit better, right? Versus those who just have the bare minimum. So it made me think about, all those conversations we've had over and over as to why we have that extra 7%, right? And I think I just wanted, your explanation was just perfect. I needed to hear that it's just a loan that has to be repaid back. And I know that in the past you had also touched upon during the recession time or prior to that we had to literally borrow money to make our payroll. So essentially it's to me, I'm looking at it as the same thing, right? Here you're borrowing from an internal fund versus an external agency, and then having to, save money and the interest rates or anything like that. So that was a good explanation. So thank you for that. And one other question on that 6.8 million that we are getting in federal funding. And that is only if we comply and implement the learning, community, and attendance plan by September 30th, right?
It is. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. So what I was going to say was, are we in line to that timeline? Will our virtual distance learning qualify for us for that funding?
I can address that, Annette.
Okay, thanks.
We are definitely, Mr. Pisani's department is the one that has to follow, just like with the LCAP, leads that work. It's well underway, but it is due to the timing of it. You have to have a public hearing, and then it has to be approved formally at a separate board meeting. And we are going to be proposing that we move the board meetings in September 1 week out. So the 1st to the 8th, if I've got it correctly, or it's the September 1 board meeting is September 8, and the September 15 to September 22 to give us a little more time. This process requires a lot of data, a lot of input, and quite frankly, they haven't even released the formal template yet, which we're expecting next week.
Okay.
So we're on it. It will be fine, but we may need just a little more time, and that's why we'll be proposing that at our next board meeting in August that we revise the calendar, which will push also, as President Nishihara pointed out, our reopening reconsideration from the 15th to the 22nd, if we do that.
Okay, and then my next question, I loved your slide that had a little section on the bottom that said, what a ride, right? We saw our January number, then we saw our May number, and then we saw our July or June number, right? So we felt great seeing the May number or the May revised number and then the 45-day revision. So where I'm going with that is, I think as long as I have been on the board, 3 years, I have not seen our budget where we are not deficit spending. Every single year, every single budget that gets presented to us, there are those red millions that are just staring at us, right? And I think after a while, you become desensitized to that issue or that number. You start thinking, okay, well, we had to cut 3.5 million last year. At least we're not cutting that much this time. It's 2.6 million this time around, right? So at what point do we start changing our conversation? Because there are multiple variables that are, that are tied into our funding. Right now, inadequate state education funding. No brainer there, right? Declining enrollment. We all know that we agree on that variable. And the possible looming recession that might be coming up. There are all these variables I can understand that are playing into our deficit, but I would like to know where was our district when we didn't have all these deficit spending? What did those years look like? When was that even a year, right? I see Linda laughing there. And I know you guys have been on the board long enough than I and some of our other members have been, But since 2016, I have not seen those numbers turn black. We have been deficit spending. And I understand those reasons, but I guess what I'm trying to understand is like, what drastic measures or changes we would have to do to kind of see how we can change that trend. And when was the last time we were not deficit spending? So some history lessons, if you guys have any to share with us.
And I can add to that. Ms. Heldman actually prepared a document that shows when the last time we were positive, and it was during the Race to the Top years. But I think you brought up a really good point, which is that it's easy to to lose in the numbers when you look at May revise and the adopted budget. The fact that we went from a COLA that was presented in January to a 0% funded COLA. That means that we're spending $3 million more this year in 2021 than we're receiving from last year. Or the delta for that is $3 million. It's really difficult to maintain a positive balance and not deficit spend when you're getting $3 million less this year than you got last year, and our costs go up. Our step and column costs increase. Our special ed costs increase. Our pension costs were stabilized, but are going to increase. So unless the state gives us money to keep, at the very least, keep pace with our costs, we're always going to be behind. And that's been the case consistently since I've been in education, with some exceptions here and there. So Annette, I don't know if you want to add to that. I will share the document with the board that shows the recent history going back to when we were last not deficit spending. Annette, I don't know if you want to address that.
No, quite right. In fact, that particular slide, Ms. Kaur, that you talked about, as you can see how it evolved, it went to the June final budget, which is 100.9 million. And as Superintendent Thompson just said, we actually lost, if you compared the real number from 1920 to what this is, it's a $3.5 million loss. Now, that's a loss, even though it's flat. It's flat funded, but we lost. And the other component to that, of course, is the fact that we lost students. If it's flat funding, we shouldn't lose, right? We should at least be maintaining it. But that's not the case for us because of the loss in terms of students, the enrollment decline. What are we doing? I would say, especially this last year, right sizing in accordance to the enrollment decline is something that we have been vigilantly doing, especially this past year. And there's more opportunities that we've started working on.
Yeah, thank you, Annette. Thank you, John. So we'll wait for that document. If I have any further questions, I'll ask then. But it doesn't sound, from what you just stated, I think I'm not confident that we're going to see those numbers change anytime soon.
The ride will go on.
Yeah, the ride will go on. Thank you. That's all I have, Lance.
Okay, any other board members?
Just the comment.
Okay,
So thank you, Annette, for presenting the information to us. And we are all relieved by the May revised budget. It's good. But at the same time, I saw that there is a possibility to borrow it from the trans. So I know that is expensive, and borrowing from the internal Fund 17, there will not be any cost to that to borrow. So I would implore the staff and CBOs to do something about the structural fixes we need to do so that we are not in that state to borrow it from the trans. And at the same time, it also presents us because we just heard from the board members that we are keen to see the budget numbers positive, not in a deficit. So that will be an opportunity for us board to address locally to invest in our kids. That's why we are having this special board meeting tonight. Thank you.
And a quick comment, President Nishihara. The good news is because we do have the money set aside for a larger ending balance, we won't need to borrow from using trans, at least at this point. And correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Heldman, but I think that's accurate.
Based on what we know now, it looks to be that we would be able to sustain it within our own cash on hand. Remember, we did used to borrow twice within a year. We used to borrow from the county treasury, and then to pay the county treasury, we had to go to a pool, borrowed from a pool, and there's a cost to that.
Yep.
And the difference then and now is we didn't have that money then. And therefore, our only option was to pay the cost of borrowing and all the other associated costs with doing a pooled tran. Even though that actually was the inexpensive version, because there are other agencies joining into it, and therefore we're splitting the cost, there still was a cost to it, and it was substantive. That was a good recollection, Ms. Chima.
So that was the reason that we sold the Cabello property, because we were in so deep red. That's
Okay.
it.
All right. Any further comments before we move on to 7.1? Okay. Moving on to 7.1. Hearing from visitors for topics on the agenda. Because of COVID-19 shelter-in-place order, the district has provided the opportunity for community members to address the board via email at publiccomment@nhusd.k12.ca.us. The deadline to submit requests was today at 2 p.m. There were no comments shared by the board via that email address. If there are any community members that wish to address the board on topics that are on the agenda, please raise your hand now using Zoom's functionality. If you are dialed in, please dial *9 to raise your hand using Zoom. And I will unmute you when it's your turn to speak. Your comments can be up to 2 minutes. Okay, I see no hands. Okay, then with that, we'll move on to 8.1, which is the resolution. We have to have a public hearing to hear about resolution 003-2021. For this one, we're going to need a motion and a second to open up the public hearing to allow for comments. I need a motion and a second.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Any objections? Okay. Then we will open up the public. Okay, so the board will now hold a public hearing on this resolution to place a parcel tax on the November 2020 ballot. No action will result if no action will result in no ballot measure being placed on the ballot. Okay, so this public hearing is now open. If there's anybody who would like to speak on this item, please raise your hand using Zoom's functionality, or *9 if you are dialed in. Okay. Seeing no further comments, we are going to. I need a motion, a second, to close this public meeting.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Okay, so member Canlis and then member Wang. Are there any objections? Okay, then this public hearing is closed. We are now moving on to item 9.1, which is our action item. The board will now need to take action to approve the resolution to place a parcel tax on the November 2020 ballot. No action will result in no ballot measure being placed on this ballot. So I need a motion and a second to approve resolution 003-2021.
I move.
Okay, we do not have a second. So that means that the motion falls on the floor if there is no second. All right, then I will take that silence as confirmation that the board does not want to pass the resolution 003-2021. So no action taken means that no parcel tax will appear on the November ballot.
President Nishihara, can we hold a discussion on that as well?
Of course.
So maybe open up the floor for discussion as to why we're, swaying in one way, in one direction or the other.
Absolutely.
For us to have discussion, we need to have a second, and
Okay,
after that, we can have the vote.
understandable.
There is no second, so there is no motion on the table to discuss. Unless, of course, you'd like me to, raise.
I'll revert back. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Then, with no further action, we're going to be moving on to item 10, which will be adjournment. Okay, so having no further business, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Nice.